The defeat of Yugoslavia took the Germans only 12 days. It was a savage campaign in which the capital Belgrade was bombed into rubble, killing 17,000 civilians. 2 more weeks and Greece was also overrun. By the end of April, the British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated by sea, leaving thousands of its men prisoners and abandoning most of its heavy equipment. As soon as the Balkan campaign was over, German armoured forces and headquarters units began to trickle northwards to join the massive forces already assembling in Romania, Poland and East Prussia. Meanwhile, reconnaissance units of the Luftwaffe worked at a frantic pace. Every available hour of daylight was used to plot Russian troop concentrations, supply dumps, headquarters and airfields, and mark them down for destruction. For the invasion of Russia, fully 75% of the entire German army, more than 3 million men, was assembled into 3 massive army groups. The armoured fists of the attack deployed more than 3,500 tanks, and the ground forces were supported by 2,500 aircraft. It was an enormous effort, and there was no possibility that it could be completely hidden from the Russians. However, Adolf Hitler had a ready explanation for Stalin. With breathtaking audacity, he sent a message telling him that he had moved his troops to Poland to protect them from British bombers. By the beginning of June, the infantry divisions were in place close to the Soviet frontiers. Soon after, the motorized units and armored divisions, the spearheads of the assault, began to edge nearer to their jumping-off positions. Army Group North was concentrated in East Prussia. Commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm von Leeb, Army Group North had 18th and 16th Armies. Von Leeb's armoured spearhead was General Herpner's Panzer Group 4. The infantry armies would field 20 divisions, and the Panzer Group 3 armoured and 3 motorised infantry divisions. The Finnish, Karelian and Southeastern armies would join the battle later, in loose cooperation with Army Group North. For air support, von Leeb could call on the 1st Air Fleet. Army Group Center was deployed in Poland. Commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, Army Group Center had 9th and 4th Armies. Its armoured forces were Hoth's Panzer Group 3 and Guderian's Panzer Group 2. The 2 infantry armies fielded 33 divisions, and the Panzer Groups 9 armoured, 6 motorised, and a cavalry division. Army Group Centre could call on 2nd Air Fleet for support. Army Group South was deployed in southern Poland and Romania. Commanded by Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt, Army Group South had 6th and 17th Armies in Poland and 11th Army in Romania. Its armoured force was Kleist's Panzer Group 1. The infantry armies had 33 divisions, and the Panzer Group 5 armoured and 3 motorised divisions. Supporting von Rundstedt would be 2 Romanian armies, the 3rd and 4th, 1 Hungarian and 1 Slovakian infantry corps, and an Italian motorized corps. The 4th Air Fleet would support ground operations. In the last fortnight before the German invasion, the pace of Soviet preparations for war accelerated dramatically. Although Stalin was still refusing to believe that the German danger was real, his commanders were forcing through precautionary measures wherever they could. 793,000 reservists were called up for training, so at least some frontline units could be brought up to strength. The building of fortifications on the frontiers was stepped up, although to do so often meant stripping army divisions of transport, tractors and men. Anti-aircraft defences were also strengthened, although their crews were still under the strictest instructions not to open fire on German aircraft. Of total Soviet strength, 2,900,000 were deployed on the western frontiers, along with 15,000 tanks and 9,000 aircraft. More divisions were on their way. However, by the time of the German invasion, a full Soviet mobilization would not even have begun. The Western Soviet Union was divided into 4 military areas: the Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa districts. After the start of the battle, these were reorganized and renamed fronts. The Northwest Front was commanded by Colonel General Fyodor Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov fielded 8th and 11th Armies, with 27th Army in its second echelon. Altogether, Northwest Front had 28 rifle, 4 tank, and 2 motorized divisions. The West Front was commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov. West Front deployed 3rd, 10th, and 4th Armies, with 13th as a Supreme Command Reserve. Altogether, 25 rifle and cavalry divisions, 13 tank and 7 motorized divisions. The Southwest Front was in the Ukraine and was commanded by Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos. Kirponos had 5th, 6th, 26th and 12th Armies, with 27 rifle and cavalry divisions, 12 tank and 6 motorized divisions. Bordering the Black Sea was the South Front, commanded by General Ivan Chulenev. Chulenev had 9th and later 18th Armies, with 17 rifle and cavalry divisions, 6 tank divisions, and 3 motorized divisions. As well as the armies in place with the 4 Soviet fronts, another 4 armies, the 22nd, 19th, 21st, and 16th, a total of 114 divisions, were already under orders to move west. These would arrive after the start of the battle. Each of the fronts also had its own aviation component of bombers and fighters for support of ground operations. Starting at 3:15 on the morning of Sunday, June the 22nd, 1941, German guns opened up on one sector of the Soviet frontier after another. The salvos were carefully targeted. Communication centers, fuel and ammunition dumps, border defenses and barrack accommodation were all pounded without mercy. At hundreds of border posts, Soviet guards were killed without warning by specially trained assault troops who secured the bridges and crossing points. Far behind the beleaguered Soviet frontier units, German warplanes had appeared with the dawn. The first waves concentrated their destructive power on Red Army airfields. Most Russian aircraft were caught helpless on the ground. On the first day alone, the Luftwaffe would destroy more than 1,400 Russian planes. As the hail of high explosives rained on the Soviet frontier defenses and rear areas, Russian commanders frantically tried to interpret their instructions from Moscow. They had been warned not to react to provocations, but no one had told them how to tell a provocation from a full-scale attack. In a welter of confusion, orders were given and then countermanded. Many units received no orders at all. Key communication centers were out of action, bombed, or the victims of nationalist saboteurs trained by the Germans. By 6 a.m., the whole frontier zone from East Prussia to the Carpathians was engulfed in one gigantic battle. However, it was in the center, in Belorussia, where half of all Germany's mechanized units were in action, that the most crucial battles of the opening phase were about to take place. Opposite the German Army Group center were 4 Soviet armies. The 10th, 3rd and 4th of the West Front and the 11th Army of the Northwest Front. The Russians occupied a salient which jutted into German territory, its center at Bialystok. Beyond Bialystok was Minsk, a key rail junction and guardian of the main highway to Moscow. To the north, Panzer Group 3 smashed through at the junction between the 2 Soviet fronts and crossed the river Niemen. Panzer Group 2 forced the river Bug and by the second day had penetrated 40 miles into Soviet territory. With the panzers racing forward on the outside, 4th and 9th Infantry Armies cut into the salient with pincer movements, squeezing between them the Russian armies around Bialystok. The panzers' objective was to meet at Minsk and prevent any Russian withdrawal. As the German spearheads sliced through the Soviet frontier armies, Moscow failed completely to grasp the dimensions of the catastrophe which had befallen Russia. On the evening of the first day, the Defense Commissar, Marshal Timoshenko, had ordered all 3 Soviet fronts to mount a general counteroffensive and sweep the enemy from Soviet territory. Timoshenko's order was a fantasy. The Soviet reserve was not yet fully mobilized, and there was no operational plan. All General Pavlov, commander of the key West Front, could do was turned for inspiration to war games played the previous January. With control and communications in the frontline areas almost completely broken down, with fuel and ammunition dumps burning, and the German Air Force in control of the skies, the attacks were doomed from the start. On June the 27th, 5 days after the invasion, the armoured jaws of Guderian's Panzer Group II and Hoth's Panzer Group III closed near Minsk. 200 miles into the Soviet Union and a third of the way to Moscow. It was a stunning achievement. In the vast pocket that had been created around Bialystok and Minsk, 32 Soviet infantry and 8 tank divisions were facing annihilation. While Army Group Center was smashing its way into the Soviet West Front, Army Group North had thrown its 600 tanks at the junction of the Soviet 8th and 11th Armies of the Northwest Front. The German spearheads were the 41st and 56th Panzer Corps of Panzer Group 4. Their objectives were to cross the rivers Niemen and Dvina, the most difficult natural obstacles in front of Army Group North. On the first day of the attack, the armoured spearheads crossed the Niemen and penetrated 50 miles. Near Rassenier, on the second day, 41st Panzer was counterattacked by 300 tanks of the Soviet 12th and 3rd Mechanized Corps. It took 4 days for the Germans to encircle and destroy the Russian force. Meanwhile, 56th Panzer Corps dashed for the river Dvina and, in a remarkable coup, seized bridges at Dvinsk intact. After the seizure of the Dvina bridges and the fall of Dvinsk, the leading formations of 56th Panzer Corps furiously set about enlarging the bridgehead. A priceless opportunity now offered itself. An immediate drive forwards would make it almost impossible for the Soviets to defend Leningrad. However, it was not to be. Orders, received with disbelief by the tankmen, were to wait for the infantry to arrive. In the end, the wait would last almost a week. While German operations in the north and in the center had produced dramatic advances, in the south, the invasion forces attacked a sector whose commanders had woken up quickly to the German threat, and whose tank forces vastly outnumbered the panzers. From the start, the invaders faced a determined resistance. On the German side, the left wing of Army Group South was made up of the 17th and 6th Armies, along with one Panzer Group, the 1st. Opposite stood the Soviet 5th, 6th and 26th Armies. While German infantry struck at the junctions between Russian formations, Panzer Group 1 drove its armoured spearhead of 600 tanks towards the town of Brody. On June the 26th, 5 Soviet mechanized corps, with over 1,000 tanks, mounted massive counterattacks from north and south. The aim was to cut through the flanks of Panzer Group 1 and meet near Dubno. The battle between Panzer Group 1 and the massed armour of the Soviet Southwestern Front was one of the fiercest of the whole invasion, lasting a full 4 days. The Russians fought furiously, and crews of German tanks and anti-tank guns found to their horror that the new Soviet T-34s and heavy KVs were almost immune to their weapons. However, the tanks were seldom handled well, or concentrated into powerful groups. They could be isolated, and after they had been immobilized by blowing off their tracks, they could be destroyed at close quarters. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was ranging freely over the battlefield, smashing Russian armor wherever it was found. The Soviet armored pincers failed to meet at Dubno. Although Panzer Group 1 took a severe battering in the battles around Dubno, it survived the confrontation, still capable of operations. The Soviets did not. The last substantial tank forces in the south had been used up, consumed in the inferno. By the end of the first week of Operation Barbarossa, all 3 German army groups had won major battles on the frontiers and had shattered every counterattack which had been thrown at them. The German High Command was jubilant, and there was already talk of reaching Moscow within a fortnight. Hitler told his followers, "To all intents and purposes, the Russians have lost the war." The euphoria would last barely a week. Events would occur on the Central Front that changed Hitler's mood from exuberance to extreme anxiety. To the astonishment of German soldiers, the encircled Russian forces in the pockets at Minsk and Bialystok were fighting on, even when their situation was plainly hopeless. Mopping up was taking far too long and costing too many German casualties. The German infantry, with no motor transport, had been slow to seal the encirclements, and many Russians were escaping the net, the very thing that Hitler had been most anxious to avoid. Although 290,000 Russian prisoners were marched westwards, and 1,500 guns and 2,500 tanks were destroyed or captured, 250,000 Russian soldiers would evade the trap or fight their way back to Soviet lines. As Hitler and his commanders realized that the victories at Bialystok and Minsk had been only partial, there were bitter recriminations. Hitler blamed the leaders of Army Group Center, particularly the Panzer generals, for leaving gaps in the ring. The Panzer leaders, for their part, were deeply frustrated. For almost a week, their advance east had been stopped, while they closed the pocket and waited for the infantry to catch up. They feared that if the momentum of the armored offensive was lost, further east, Russian resistance would stiffen behind the rivers Dnieper and Dvina. On July the 3rd, Joseph Stalin made his first broadcast to the Soviet people since the start of the German invasion. Laying aside the cloak of communist ideology, he appealed for a patriotic war. There would be no surrender, and everything that could be of use to the invader was to be destroyed in his path. Behind the lines, partisan bands were to be formed, and meantime, the strategy was to defend the Soviet Union as far to the west as possible, where most of its population and its industries were based. Provision was being made to dismantle key factories which lay in the path of the invader and ship them east, along with their skilled workers. But it would all take time. Terrified that the Soviet state faced complete collapse, Stalin quickly introduced the harshest penalties for those accused of being panic-mongers, cowards, or incompetents. In the following weeks, Pavlov, the commander of West Front, was executed, along with members of his staff. As for lesser commanders, many who had broken out of encirclements were also shot for not having resisted to the end. Meanwhile, on the German side of the lines, captured Red Army soldiers thought to be communists, commissars or Jews were handed over by the army to SS Special Action Groups for immediate execution. In the months to come, many Red Army units would fight to the bitter end because their leaders dared neither surrender nor retreat. On the same day as Stalin called for a great patriotic war, the panzer leaders of Army Group Center at last got the go-ahead to resume their drive east. The main panzer forces had been static for almost a week, and now, on the very day the general offensive was resumed, the weather broke. As sudden rainstorms, typical of early July, turned the sandy tracks into streaming rivers of mud, the advancing armored divisions found themselves immobile for hours at a time. All the while, the Russian defense became more determined. Many bridges were blown, and for the first time, mines were laid to slow the German advance, an easy task with the convoys confined to the very few roads. The delays gave the Soviets time to organize for a massive armored counterblow. The ultimate objective for Army Group Center was the city of Smolensk, which commanded the road to Moscow. Facing the Germans, along the rivers Dnieper and Dvina, were stretches of the old Stalin Line fortifications. The defenders were 13th Army of the West Front and the 22nd, 20th and 21st Armies of the Supreme Command Reserve. Another army, the 19th, was forming up at Vitebsk, while the 16th was arriving at Smolensk. It was the threat in the north, from Panzer Group 3's 39th Panzer Corps, that most worried the Russians. On July the 6th, 20th Army's 7th and 5th Mechanized Corps launched an attack with 700 tanks. The Germans had overwhelming air support, and in a 3-day battle, the two Soviet mechanized corps were virtually wiped out. Meanwhile, 20th Panzer Division won a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Dvina and threatened Vitebsk. To the south, away from the main crossings, Panzer Group 2 launched surprise attacks, forcing the River Dnieper. The 13th Army was pushed back, losing 5 divisions. As both German panzer groups drove east, 3 Soviet armies faced the prospect of encirclement around Smolensk. South of Smolensk, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group advanced at speed, and its 29th Motorized Infantry Division took the city on July the 16th. However, to the north, Hoth's 3rd Panzer was moving much more slowly. The terrain was swampy, the rain was still a problem, and the Russians were fighting desperately to escape the trap that was developing. On July the 18th, the great armoured pincers of the 2 panzer groups came within 10 miles of closing. But the jaws would not finally snap shut for another 8 days. In the end, although 300,000 Russians were captured, more than 200,000 would break out to stand between the Germans and Moscow. By now, nearly 4 weeks into the campaign, it was obvious to German commanders and to Adolf Hitler himself that the number of divisions the Red Army could field had been grossly underestimated. There was no sign that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. In fact, there were worrying threats to the flanks of Army Group Center. On August the 4th, Adolf Hitler flew to Army Group Center's headquarters at Borisov, east of Minsk. By now, he had lost faith in battles of encirclement and had begun to believe that he could best defeat the Soviet Union by inflicting severe economic damage. That meant making better progress in the south to cut off Russia's oil, and in the north, the speedy capture of Leningrad. He had come to Minsk to tell the commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock, that his drive east towards Moscow was to be stopped, and his tanks were to be sent to Leningrad and the Ukraine. Hitler's plan involved sending the armor on 300-mile detours. The panzer generals, Guderian and Hoth, were appalled. Moscow was only 200 miles from the front, and most of the Red Army was deployed around the city. The generals were certain that only an attack there gave any chance of winning the war outright. However, Hitler was adamant, and a final desperate appeal by the Army Commander-in-Chief, von Brauchitsch, was rejected out of hand. Hitler complained that his generals knew nothing of the economic aspects of war. The panzers were to be diverted, and that was final. By mid-July, below the Pripyat marshes, the 6th Army of Army Group South, along with Panzer Group 1, had reached to within a few miles of Kiev. The armor had then swung south, while the advance from Romania, with the Romanian 3rd Army and the German 11th and 17th, pushed east. 3 Soviet armies were squeezed into a pocket near Uman. As the pocket was eliminated, the tanks turned north and crossed the Dnieper. Meanwhile, Guderian's Panzer Group 2 had driven south and crossed the river Desna, with 2nd Army on its right. The 2 panzer groups now threatened to trap 4 Soviet armies and parts of 2 more against the great bend of the river Dnieper. For its final thrust at Leningrad, 4th Panzer Group of Army Group North had, on Hitler's orders, been reinforced by tanks from Army Group Center. On August the 8th, the panzers broke through Soviet defenses, and while 16th Army attacked to the northeast, 18th Army cleared Estonia and advanced around Lake Peipus. By the end of August, Panzer Group 4 and 18th Army had penetrated to within 30 miles of Leningrad. Meanwhile, the Finns had pushed southeast on both sides of Lake Ladoga, reaching the old Finnish-Soviet frontiers. On September the 9th, Army Group North began a final push on Leningrad. Within 2 days, German soldiers were on the heights only 7 miles from the city, and artillery was pounding the inhabitants relentlessly. Hitler's latest orders were that Leningrad should not be stormed. The advance had severed all of its road and rail links to the rest of the Soviet Union, and the city was now to be bombed, shelled, and starved into submission. The Führer had changed the priorities of the campaign yet again. Leningrad could wait. Army Group North's tanks were to be sent to the center for an all-out drive on Moscow. It was the Soviet West Front, launching furious counterattacks with its ground and air forces, which had drawn Hitler's restless attention to the Moscow sector. The problem was that Army Group Center was in no position to launch an immediate offensive. It was only 13 days since most of the group's tanks had been sent on their marathon drives to the north and south. These operations, particularly the one around Kiev, had to be finished before Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, could begin. The encirclement of Soviet forces in the south was achieved on September the 16th, when Kleist's Panzer Group 1 and Guderian's 24th Corps met at Lochwitzer, 120 miles behind Kiev. For the Russians, a disaster of staggering dimensions now unfolded. The encircled Russian armies at Kiev did not give up easily. A savage battle in which the Soviets were hammered by artillery, tanks and aircraft had to be fought before the pocket was reduced. In the end, after 10 days of carnage, the Germans claimed 600,000 Red Army soldiers captured. No one knew how many had been killed in what Hitler called the greatest battle in history. After Kiev, for the first time since the invasion, the Red Army no longer outnumbered the Germans, and there were no more reserves. To defend Moscow, Stalin could field 800,000 men in 83 divisions, but no more than 25 of those divisions were fully effective, and there was a desperate shortage of armor and aircraft. On the German side, there were 2 million men in 70 divisions. Almost 1/3 of the divisions were mechanized, the highest proportion of mechanized units to infantry in any German attack of the war so far. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, began on October the 2nd. In front of Army Group Center were the Soviet West and Bryansk fronts. There was also a series of elaborate defense lines, up to 250 miles long. The first centered on Vyazma and the others on Mozhaisk. The first blow took the Soviets completely by surprise. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, returning from the Kiev battle, took Orel, a vital road junction 75 miles behind the first Russian defense line. 3 days later, the panzers pushed on Bryansk, another communications center, while 2nd Army attacked from the west. 3 Russian armies were trapped. To the north, 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies threw their pincers around Vyazma, trapping another 5 Soviet armies. Moscow's first line of defense had been shattered in the opening blows, and the door to Moscow had been burst open. It was Stalin's insistence on manning defensive lines to the very end that made the situation at Bryansk and Vyazma so catastrophic. The pockets yielded 663,000 Russian prisoners, bringing the tally since the start of the invasion to 3 million. Once again, the German High Command allowed itself to believe that the war in the East was won. This time, they were certain their belief was justified. On the Russian side, only 90,000 men and a handful of tanks were left on the last defense line in front of Moscow. In desperation, Stalin summoned General Zhukov, who had been organizing the defense of Leningrad, and gave him the job of saving the capital. Weeks before, Zhukov had resigned as chief of the general staff after a disagreement with the dictator. But now Stalin chose to forget their differences. By this time, the situation outside Moscow was critical. On October the 13th, 4th Infantry Army penetrated the last Soviet defense line at Kaluga. At the same time, to the north, 3rd Panzer penetrated to within 90 miles of the capital and looked set to break into the Soviet rear. For the Russians, serious as the situation was on the flanks, in the center there was mortal danger. There, 10th Panzer Division and the SS Das Reich Motorized Division had beaten off a furious counterattack at Borodino. They were now driving up the Smolensk to Moscow highway, advancing on Mozhaisk, the key to the central sector of the Moscow defense line, and only 60 miles from the city. With the German armies on the threshold of the capital, there was panic in Moscow. Martial law was declared. Government departments and embassies were evacuated. And there was a frantic effort to build last-ditch defenses in and around the city. Although the citizens of Moscow expected little mercy from the Germans, in fact, none knew the savage reality of Hitler's plans for the Soviet capital. The German armies had been instructed not to accept its surrender. Its inhabitants might be allowed to flee, but the city was to be obliterated from the face of the earth. In its place was to be built a gigantic reservoir. Almost from the beginning of Operation Typhoon, the weather had deteriorated steadily. The German advance, first in the south and then in the centre, had gradually slowed as the season of rain and sleet had begun. Under the weight of traffic, the 3 roads on which the whole offensive depended for its supplies were reduced to quagmires. As the rain and snow persisted into a 3rd week, the supply system broke down completely. Eventually, only tracked vehicles could move at all, and their fuel consumption soared, while engines rapidly wore out. Meantime, the troops were living in appalling conditions, permanently wet, cold, and utterly exhausted. The advance slowed to as little as 2 miles a day. On October the 31st, the German Army High Command ordered a halt in Operation Typhoon. For General Zhukov, the pause was of priceless benefit. Although his forces were desperately weak, down to 190 working tanks, fresh formations were being created at great speed, and in little over a month, 11 new armies would be raised. Although some of the new formations were made up of barely trained conscripts, 30 divisions would be well-equipped and immensely tough Siberian troops. These had been freed from the eastern frontiers as Soviet intelligence assured Stalin there was no longer a threat from the Japanese. With the Siberians would come 1,000 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. On November the 7th, in a defiant gesture of normality, the annual Revolution Day parade was held in Moscow. The night before, the first severe frosts had hardened the ground. Only 50 miles from the city, the German armoured columns were once more capable of movement. The last great effort to capture Moscow began on November the 15th. In increasingly heavy falls of snow, and with temperatures sinking ominously, the Germans threw themselves at the Soviet defences. For their part, the Russians, on Zhukov's orders, launched a series of spoiling attacks. Little quarter was given on either side. Both attacking and defending troops knew that this could be a war-winning battle. Facing the German advance on Moscow were 3 Soviet fronts: Kalinin, West, and Southwest. However, it was the 6 mostly understrength armies of General Zhukov's West Front that would bear the main weight of the assault. The German intention was that 3rd and 4th Panzer armies would cross the Volga Canal and envelop Moscow from the northeast. 2nd Panzer Army would first take Tula, then strike behind Moscow from the southeast to close with the northern pincer. As the Russians reacted and moved to the flanks, 4th Infantry Army would smash in the center. In 2 weeks of desperate fighting, in ever more arduous and exhausting conditions, the battle in the north slowly but remorselessly crept towards the Russian capital. However, in the south, against all the odds, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was being blocked. At Tula, the Soviet 50th Army, in spite of being almost surrounded, could not be dislodged. Then came a stunning blow for the Germans. At Kashira, on November the 27th, a savage attack by well-equipped Siberian infantry, T-34s, and new Katyusha rocket launchers inflicted a severe and shocking defeat on Guderian's forces. While Guderian's attack was being blocked, then broken to the north, after 10 days of bitter and continuous fighting, 4th Panzer succeeded in crossing the Volga Canal within 20 miles of Moscow and beginning the encirclement of the capital. On December the 2nd, a forward patrol penetrated to within 15 miles of the Kremlin. Hitler and his senior commanders were convinced that one last gargantuan effort would see the final collapse of Russian resistance. It would all depend on the last battalion. On December the 2nd, the first blizzards of winter swept across the German armies facing Moscow. The war in the east was supposed to have been long since won, and the Wehrmacht had never been equipped for conditions like these. At night, the temperature would soon plummet to as low as minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite and disease had already begun to cause as many German casualties as the endless Russian counterattacks. Dead and wounded had reached 155,000 in 3 weeks. And the strength of the infantry divisions had fallen to 50%. Meanwhile, the bitter cold caused serious problems for weapons and vehicles. Guns failed as their recoil systems froze, and engines had to be run every 4 hours, devouring fuel that was already in desperately short supply. Most disturbing of all for men who had always been able to count on protection from the air, conditions all too often grounded the Luftwaffe, while the Red Air Force seemed to grow more active as each day passed. On December the 1st, in the center, the German Fourth Army had launched a final massive effort to smash what defenses remained in front of Moscow. Everything depended on the Russians having no reserves. However, for weeks, Zhukov had been denied reinforcements, as Stalin had held back increasingly powerful reserve formations, including the bulk of the Siberian divisions and their armor. The strength of the defenders was now up to over 500,000 men. On December the 5th, Zhukov launched the reserves in a massive counterattack. The Russian offensive was launched along a front 600 miles long. To the Germans, whose own offensive was being carried on with the last ounce of their strength, it came as a hideous shock. Along the entire length of the line, German armies were shattered into thousands of isolated units, fighting desperately for survival. The Battle of Moscow was lost, and with it, the German Wehrmacht had lost the battle for Russia. Although the Russians were strong enough to throw the Germans back from the gates of Moscow and liberate 11,000 towns and villages, they were still nowhere near capable of inflicting a decisive defeat on the invaders. A second counteroffensive in January stalled against increasingly solid German defenses on a line still deep inside the Soviet Union. The battle for Russia had cost the German army 250,000 dead, 500,000 wounded, and most of its tanks. Hitler fired 2 field marshals and 35 generals, but nothing could change the fate to which Germany was now condemned. No new sources of oil or strategic materials had been won, and the Wehrmacht was embroiled in conflicts on 2 fronts. Worst of all, America had entered the war the previous December. Hitler now had to face the very thing he had been desperate to avoid from the start: Russia, Britain, and the United States in an alliance Germany could never hope to defeat.